guys, I hope you're doing okay. Hope you're enjoying this weather. Oh my goodness, isn't it lovely? Isn't this sunshine really nice to see? And if you're one of the ones that are able to get out and about and go on your socially distanced walks and stuff like that, then I hope you're really enjoying it. So this week I'm going to move on to a little incident that happened a little bit after the one that we spoke about last time, when Jesus was talking about people being blessed and what Jesus's blessing might look like. And it's a really interesting little snippet, and I love it because I think it tells us so much about how Jesus expects things of us, expects us to act in a way that maybe we wouldn't realise that is acceptable. And it involves John the Baptist. And so a little bit of background on John the Baptist. So John the Baptist was actually one of Jesus's cousins, and their mums knew each other, and when their mothers were pregnant with Jesus and John respectively, they had some great conversations about what these children were going to grow up to be. And when John was born in unusual circumstances to a mother that was quite elderly, or the mother that couldn't have children, and when he was born, there were all these prophecies, and there were these words from God that were spoken over his really early life, which gave him this particular purpose. And the purpose of John the Baptist was going to be the one that told the people that the Messiah was coming, that Jesus was going to come, and that Jesus was going to change everything. And so John knew from a really, really early age, as a little child, he went and lived this bizarre life out in the desert, and he was a bit of a odd bloke, to be fair. But he knew the purpose behind his life. And so sure enough, just before Jesus starts his ministry, just before Jesus comes out of being a carpenter and goes into being this itinerant preacher, John comes out just before him, and he starts saying, you know, this Messiah is coming, this person that we've been waiting for so long is going to come, and now is the time for you to look at how you're living your life. Now is the time for you to turn back to God. Now is the time for you to be baptized. And he was quite forceful about it. They call him one of the last of the Old Testament prophets, because the prophets in the first part of the Bible, in the story of God's chosen family, the Israelites, were the people that used to speak of what God was going to do. And so John's the last of the prophets, even though his story comes into the New Testament, which is the bit about, you know, Jesus and his life and his death and his resurrection and the early church. John's in that. He's the last one to be saying, look, Jesus is coming, you have to get ready, you have to prepare. And he spent his whole life sorting this out, and this has been his purpose, his one aim from his birth. This is what you're going to do. And then we get to this incident where, again, Jesus has been teaching and he's been preaching and he's been healing lots of people. And then Jesus is somewhere one day, and John is somewhere else. But John's got his own band of followers. Again, I've said that it's not unusual that different itinerant preachers, different teachers, if you like, would have their own little band of disciples that followed them. And one day Jesus is doing what Jesus does, and John's disciples, a couple of John's disciples, come up to him, and they've been sent by John. And these disciples come with a question that has come from John. And the question that they ask is, are you the one? John sent us to ask you, Jesus, are you the one that we should be expecting, or should we be expecting somebody else? Now that's a pretty weird question to come from John, because you would think, given John's history, given John's background, given everything that John knew, everything that John had grown up to believe, everything that was anything to do with John's life, if you'd have pointed out one person that would have said, yeah, there he is, that's Jesus, that's the one you've got to follow, that's the one you've got to listen to, he's going to be the Messiah, he's going to be the Saviour, you would have expected that to be John. And yet at this point, John's obviously having some kind of crisis. John is doubting. John is saying, I always thought it was going to be you, Jesus, but now at this point in my life, I'm not quite sure. Is it you? Is it you that we are to expect? If this can happen to John, really, if this can happen to John with all of those things that were spoken over his life, if this doubt can creep into John's mind, it can creep into anybody's mind. And you see, John's not alone. It is not only John that doubts in the Bible. There are probably more people that doubt in the Bible than there are that have these rock solid faiths that never waver, that never question, that never wonder what God's up to. If you look right back to the one of the first big figures in the Bible, the person that was going to become the father of God's chosen people, Abraham, God had told him that he was going to have a son. God had told him that from Abraham his descendants would become more numerous than the stars in the sky. But Abraham was getting on a bit, and his wife was really getting on a bit, and he started to question God. He started to doubt. He started to think, well, maybe I'd better take control here, because I don't know anymore whether I believe in God's promise. And he went off and had a child with one of his servants, or one of his wife's servants, because he was just doubting. There was that doubt in his mind about what God had done. When you look at Jesus and his disciples after his death, Jesus's disciples were going around going, oh my goodness, he's been raised from the dead. This is weird, but he has been raised from the dead. And then there's this poor guy, Doubting Thomas. I have a lot of sympathy for this disciple that we now call Doubting Thomas, because Doubting Thomas said, you know what, unless I see it, unless I actually see it, I'm not going to believe it on the evidence of your testimony. I want to see it myself. God is really used to dealing with doubt. God is used to dealing with us when we find it difficult to believe. Because the thing is, if we're honest, there is a lot in the Bible that is difficult to believe. There is a lot in the Bible that we find it challenging to believe. You know, when you read of things like mothers seemingly regularly having children in their 70s or their 80s, you know, that's weird. When you look at some of the miraculous events that are documented in the Bible, and we think, well, they just don't fit with any logic or understanding of the scientific order of things that I get, you know, this is weird. It's not only stuff like that, it's stuff like, you know, the Old Testament in particular, it is full of blood and guts. You know, people's arms are being chopped off all the time and legs are flying, but these are people. And it would seem that there's so much war, there's so much violence, there's so much destruction. And we start to doubt the character of God, if not the existence of God altogether. We start thinking, well, what is this all about actually? How can I reconcile this with a God who's supposed to love me? When we look at things like people in the history of the church that have been debarred, women debarred from all sorts of things just because they're women, disabled people debarred from all sorts of service because of their disability, people with gender identity issues, there are an awful lot of things in the Bible that would cause us maybe to doubt and maybe to question the existence of God. And the thing is that if we don't have all the answers, there is something within us that makes us pull back, that makes us start thinking, well, is this right? Does this make sense? Is this something that I should put my whole life on the line for? I want us to pull back a minute and just have a look at our normal lives, and just have a look at, let's just take the argument away from pure spirituality at the moment. I mean, I believe that our physical and our emotional and our mental and our spiritual all tie together to make us one person. That's my belief. But let's just take the spiritual out of it at the moment and look at our normal lives. There is, I think everybody would agree, something inherent within us that causes us to have faith. To have faith in our normal everyday activities, in our normal lives. Because if we didn't have faith, we would probably be too frightened to leave the house, and we might even be frightened to stay in our houses. I think there's something in our character that gives us faith. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. So if you've had a brain hemorrhage, and you're just about to be operated on by a brain surgeon, within yourself, unless you happen to be a brain surgeon too, you will have no real idea or clue about the techniques that brain surgeon is going to use, about what the operation's going to involve in any major way, about all the little different things that are going to have to happen to enable you to get through that surgery and recover. But you have faith that the brain surgeon does, and therefore you trust, and therefore you accept. When that same brain surgeon goes home and walks in through his front door, he's probably got absolutely no clue about what it is in the structure and the positioning and the bolting together and everything of the roof timbers of his house that are going to stop his, roof from falling down into his dinner while he's sitting there with his kids. But he has faith. He has faith in that. And therefore he accepts and he trusts and he has faith that his roof isn't going to fall down while he's eating his dinner. We live by faith most of the time. We just don't recognize it, if you like, as faith. If there wasn't something within us that had faith that things were going to operate in the way that we expect them to operate most of the time, then we would be too scared to move. So faith is a thing that is inherent within all of us, and I think all of us would agree with that. It doesn't mean that we won't always have doubts. There was a great example of this that happened to me just this week. I was reading, I don't tend to listen to everything on the pandemic at the moment because it would drive you stir crazy, but occasionally, more often than not, I will pick up on the press conference that's happening every day. And I was listening to the press conference a little while ago, a few days ago. And one of the questions that was asked, I thought, well, that's an interesting question. And one of these, the question that was asked was referred to the scientist. They have the chief scientific officer, the chief medical officer, normally those sort of people there. And one of the questions that was asked was referred to the chief scientific officer. And I thought, well, yeah, let's see what your answer is to this, because I'm struggling to see the logic in what's being presented to us. And the chief scientific officer gave the answer. And that answer seemingly was based on the scientific evidence, and it made me so furious. Honestly, Dan was, my husband Dan, he was scared. He was sitting in the corner sort of thinking, I'm not going to speak to her for a while. I was furious. I was absolutely livid. And what I did was I stormed into my kitchen and I started like rage cleaning my kitchen, which was great because by the time I calmed down, at least I had a clean kitchen. But the reason that I was so furious was because I thought that the answer that they gave couldn't possibly have been based on the scientific evidence, because it didn't make logical sense to me. And therefore, and what upset me was that if that answer that they gave was not based on the scientific evidence, then how on earth could I believe or trust in anything else that they were saying? So I doubted the whole lot. I doubted the whole lot, and I was furious and I was upset, because at that point in my mind, I'm like, well, how are we ever going to get out of this if I'm doubting what the evidence is that the science is being based on? Now, a few days down the line, I now realise, and having had time to think about it, the answer that was given, yeah, it was a bit based on the science, but it was also based on behavioural psychology. It was also based on how people act. It was also based on what the overall strategy is to get us as a generation, as a nation, from A to B. It was based on a much bigger picture than the little bit that I was dealing with. And I couldn't see that big picture at the time, but they could. but they could. We deal with a God that sees the bigger picture all the time. And we don't see it. You see, the thing is, God isn't somebody that's just like us, only bigger. God is not the same as us. God does not have our mind. God has a mind that is unfathomable. We can't understand everything that God does. And maybe that's where faith comes in, because we have to trust, like I had to trust those scientists, we have to trust that God does know, that God is seeing the bigger picture. And maybe all that God wants us to do, this whole, well, you know, yeah, that's great for you that have faith, but I don't have faith. Actually, we all have faith. Actually, we all have faith. Otherwise, we would not get out of our beds in the morning. But maybe what God's asking us to do is to transfer that faith that we have in the normal, everyday parts of our lives into the spiritual centre of our lives. Maybe that's what he's asking us to do, is to transfer that faith into all of our lives. Not just the practical or the physical, but into the emotional, into the mental, into the spiritual centre of our lives. And understand that he sees the bigger picture, even when we don't see the bigger picture. We don't have to have all the answers. We really don't. The longer I'm a Christian, the less I have a pat answer for. I used to have pat answers to everything. I used to be able to produce you a fridge magnet that would meet your every need and answer your every question, and I'm not like that anymore. The longer I go on, the less answers I have, and probably the more faith I have. But I still doubt. I still doubt. Jesus is used to doubts. Jesus doesn't expect us not to have doubts. And what I think is beautiful is the way that Jesus deals with our doubts. They don't surprise him. When Thomas, his disciple, said, unless I see the nail holes in his hands and the piercing in his side, I won't believe. And Jesus came to Thomas and he said, here, Thomas, now you can see. When John's disciples come to Jesus, Jesus doesn't say, for goodness sake, John, you know, go back and tell John I didn't really expect that of him, you know, of him above all. Do you know what he says? He says, now listen, all of you that are listening to me, I tell you, there is no one better walking the planet at the moment than John. He's above everybody. He is fantastic. I am for John. I am with John. I think John is doing a great job. This guy that's just doubted whether he is actually who he says he is, whether he is the Messiah or not. Jesus says, I think actually John, with his truthfulness, with his doubts, is doing an amazing job. And you know, disciples, you go back to John and you tell him that the blind are seeing, and that the deaf are hearing, and that the lame are walking, and that the dead are being raised. Jesus provides John with the reassurance that he needs. Jesus understands that our doubts don't mean the end of our relationship. In fact, Jesus understands that our doubts can be the catalyst for that relationship to go deeper. Because if we're not honest in our relationship with Jesus, then we don't have anything. So if we're angry, or if we're doubtful, or if we're in a position where we say, well, yeah, I like some of what you say, Jesus, but I'm really not sure whether you are the Messiah, just like John did. Jesus says, that's okay. Just come to me anyway. Just come to me with your doubts. Come to me with your questions. You might not get all of the answers, but you'll get me. And at the end of the day, that really is what you need. God bless.